Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
So what I want to talk to you about today is the most consequential political conspiracy that never existed in the English-speaking world. In the year 1678, an informer emerged in London to tell King Charles II that he was in imminent danger of assassination. This plot was, according to the informer, a conspiracy of English Roman Catholics. And their object in assassinating the king was to bring Charles's brother James, a Catholic convert, to the English throne. The story that the informer, a man named Titus Oates, revealed was, as it was elaborated and as it was unfolded over the course of a number of weeks, increasingly preposterous. King Charles and his brother both were well aware that the information that Titus Oates was divulging was sketchy at best, and soon they realized that it was, by and large, an elaborate fiction. Nevertheless, the information that Oates revealed panicked the nation. And it did so really because of a concatenation of coincidences which helped to further the narrative that Titus Oates had come to peddle. In order to fully appreciate why virtually everybody in the British Isles believed in this preposterous story, believed it in amazing firmness, was rooted not simply in the convincing details of Oates' story, because those details were increasingly unconvincing, but rather in the longer-term history of England going back to the days of Queen Mary, better known as Bloody Mary. The willingness of the majority of the English people to believe that such a conspiracy existed was rooted in their fear and hatred of Roman Catholics. And that story goes back to the reign of Queen Mary, who, in her determination to root out heresy, created some 400 Protestant martyrs. That was the beginning of an anti-Catholic tradition in England that would grow and develop over the course of somewhat more than a century. English people in the late 1670s knew a number of things for certain, one of which was that Catholics were evil, that they followed a religion that was in league with Antichrist, and that Catholics represented a tremendous danger to Protestants and to the Protestant monarchy in Britain. In most people's minds, there was no question but that a Catholic would enthusiastically embrace the idea of assassinating a Protestant king. especially if the reward was the arrival on the throne of a Catholic. The general fear that people had of Catholics was rooted to some degree in reality as well. Most of you may have heard at some point or another of the famous Gunpowder Plot. In 1605, a group of disaffected Catholics attempted to blow up the entire ruling order of England, including King James I, his family, the entirety of the nobility, all of the judges, all of the bishops of the Protestant Church, all of the members of Parliament were to be the victims of this bomb. Gunpowder was concealed underneath the floor of Parliament, and it only succeeded in failing, that's the wrong way to put it, but at the last moment, this conspiracy was uncovered, and it did not come off. But everyone in England in 1678 was raised on stories of the narrow escape that the entire political nation had in 1605. Furthermore, in 1641, Roman Catholics in the English colony of Ireland rose in rebellion, and in doing so, they massacred literally thousands of Protestants. So it was not a hard sell to get English people to believe that such a conspiracy existed. It did not, however, but most people believed it. The principal informers, and there was more than one, but the most important was a man named Titus Oates, dreamed up this conspiracy as a last-ditch attempt to rescue himself from his lifetime of very, very bad choices. Titus Oates was born in the early 1640s. His father was a minister of the Church of England. And Oates himself joined the ministry as well, early in the 1660s, shortly after Charles II's restoration. As a minister of the Church of England, Titus Oates was not very successful. Even in his education, he, from an early stage, demonstrated that he was prone to laziness, malfeasance, and dishonesty. He went to Cambridge University and left there with debts owing to most of the shopkeepers in town, claiming that he had earned a degree that he had not earned, and persuading somehow a bishop of the Church of England to ordain him as a minister in the church. As a minister, he proceeded from one disaster to another. He was run out of a parish in Kent because of accusations of blasphemy, of pederasty, and chicken stealing. Having lost his living in the church in Kent, he proceeded to find himself a berth aboard a Royal Navy warship as a chaplain. This gig ended in his dismissal on a charge of sodomy. He returned from sea to London to find his welcome completely worn out among English Protestants, and so he decided that he would become a Catholic. He presented himself to the leading figures of the Jesuit order in London. There was a Jesuit mission in London that operated secretly because it was illegal to be a Catholic clergyman in Restoration England. In fact, it was an offense potentially punishable by death. Oates somehow persuaded the head of the Jesuit mission to take him on as a convert. The Jesuits sponsored Oates on a trip to Europe, where he was to receive the standard, extremely sophisticated Jesuit education. He first went to a Jesuit college in Spain, where within weeks he was expelled for interfering with young boys. He then moved to a Jesuit college in the Netherlands, where the same thing happened. By the summer of 1678, Titus Oates had worn out his welcome among English Protestants, and he had worn out his welcome among English Catholics. He had nowhere to go and nothing to look forward to. It was in that atmosphere that he met a paranoid clergyman of the Church of England, whose name was Israel Tongue, and the two of them hatched this conspiracy theory. In August 1678, Oates presented this information to the king himself, who was, as I said earlier, skeptical. But a week after Oates had revealed this plan or this plot, the magistrate, the London Justice of the Peace, who had initially received Oates's deposition, the information that he was peddling, disappeared. And several days later was found dead in a ditch on the outskirts of London. The death of that magistrate, whose name was Edmund Godfrey, was the kickstart to a national panic, because people assumed that Godfrey's death was the result of a Catholic attempt to shut him up, to suppress the information that Oates had about the plot. A week after the discovery of Godfrey's body, a new session of Parliament opened. And this was also a key moment, a key coincidence in the spreading of a believable story. Parliament undertook an investigation, as well as the king. And Parliament in 1678 was deeply divided between those who supported Charles II's government, his ministers, and those who opposed them. The opponents of the king's government seized the plot as a tool, as a weapon to use against Charles's government. So in that atmosphere, the information about the plot suddenly became politicized. And within months, England had been divided dramatically between those who fervently believe in the plot, or who pretend fervently to believe in the plot, and those who reject it. As the investigation of Oates's charges unfold, revelations are made that astonish many people in England and persuade many of the reality of Oates's charge. One of the things which is essential in this process was that when the authorities fanned out across the country in response to Oates's naming names, because he knew names, he had lived among English Catholics for some time. He knew names, he knew places, he knew a great deal about the secret Catholic underground in England. What was important was that most people in England didn't realize just how sophisticated the Catholic underground was. Catholics had had a century to perfect their ability to hide from the authorities. Yet beneath the surface was an established and quite sophisticated Catholic network which provided the sacraments to the faithful, which involved secret endowments which paid for the expenses of the Catholic mission. There were all sorts of revelations made in the investigation that followed these charges. And each time a new Catholic cell was uncovered, more people were persuaded of the reality of the plot. Soon the jails in England began to fill up with hapless Catholics who were arrested on suspicion of being involved in the plot. The first Catholic victim of the plot was a young Catholic goldsmith who lived in London, who was supposedly overheard damning King Charles and wishing for his death. In the atmosphere of the fall of 1678, the mere expression of words like that would ensure your arrest and potential trial as a traitor. William Staley, the young goldsmith, was arrested on the information of a pair of shady barflies who were actually seeking a reward. It's highly doubtful that Staley ever said the words that he was accused of, and yet in the atmosphere of the day, his trial ended in his conviction and swift execution. He was the first of the victims of the so-called Popish Plot. There would be 24 others whose trials will stretch out between November of 1678 and finally ending in the summer of 1681. These so-called traitors were convicted by Protestant juries who were predisposed to convict Catholics because it was their belief that Catholics were by nature traitors. The trials that were held were deeply unjust. In 17th century English criminal law, a defendant in a treason trial was already behind the 8 ball because he was not allowed legal counsel. He was not allowed to swear witnesses for the defense. The legal theory behind that was that a defendant in a royal trial of that nature was being prosecuted by the king. And it was unlawful to accuse the king of being a liar, which a sworn defendant would inevitably have to do because he would be contradicting the king's evidence. These trials were presided over by judges who were deeply hostile to the defendants, and they invariably resulted in convictions. The fate of the defendants in those trials was gruesome. Punishment for traitors in the 17th century involved drawing and quartering in public. It was a horrendous way to go, but no one who was accused in these trials was acquitted until the summer of 1679, when the Queen's doctor, a man named George Wakeman, was put on trial. He was a Catholic. He was accused of agreeing to poison King Charles for the bargain basement price of £15,000, which at the time was a colossal sum of money. The trial of George Wakeman marks an important turning point in the plot, and what follows is a fairly rapid growth of skepticism about the charges that Oates and his fellow informers were making. Their charges at this point had become increasingly wild. They were at this point accusing the king's wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, of also participating in the plot, supposedly humiliated by her husband's infidelities, which were legion and everyone knew about them. But nevertheless, it was clear that charges against the Queen were fanciful at best. At least most people believe so. Those who decided that they were going to support those charges were by this time largely committed opponents of the king's government. And they seized upon charges against the Queen as a way to prevent the king's brother from inheriting the English throne. The idea on the part of the opposition was to pressure King Charles into abandoning his wife, divorcing her, marrying anew, and fathering a legitimate heir. At this point, Charles II has already got 14 children, but they are all illegitimate. And the opposition hoped to bring a new queen on the scene, and failing that, they hoped to pressure King Charles to accept his eldest bastard child as his heir. None of that happened, but it was the first step in the total politicization of the so-called Popish Plot, because it leads to a movement in Parliament to exclude James, Duke of York, from the succession. And what that does is it creates in England, for the first time, what amounts to a two-party political system, with those opposing exclusion, supporting the king and his absolute determination to keep his brother in the line of succession, being called the Tories. This was a term of abuse. Tories in the 1670s and 80s were Irish Catholic bandits who roamed the countryside of Ireland, generally making mischief and barbarous atrocities against good folk in Ireland. Their opponents, those who support exclusion, come to be called Whigs, and that too was a term of abuse. A Whig was a fanatical Protestant bandit who infested the lowlands of Scotland. They went about attacking people who they believed were enemies of their version of Protestant extremism. So these two parties emerge committed to an ideological position, and that is that it was within the power of the representatives of the people in Parliament to determine the line of succession to the English throne. This development would prove to be of enormous significance over the long term, because the last time England was so divided politically between two opposing political viewpoints, the result had been civil war. That is because in the 1640s, the English political system operated under a principle in which the pursuit and the maintenance of a consensus all across the political nation was absolutely essential. What happened in the early 1640s was that that consensus fell apart. And the only solution, the only way to restore that consensus, was to kill everybody who failed to accept it. And hence you had the English Civil War. But in this period, the so-called exclusion crisis, which emerges from the Popish Plot, what you have is the creation of these two political parties and the realization and later the acceptance of the idea that you can have political competition, you can disagree on major political issues, and yet you do not have to kill everybody on the other side. Now, Whigs and Tories do not like one another. They are perfectly happy to employ the most atrocious methods against one another. Judicial murder from time to time is an option that both sides pursue. But they don't take up arms and plunge the nation back into civil war. The growth of these two parties also spurs a massive increase in political literature and propaganda. Both sides attempt to win their case through the presentation of their arguments to the public, and they do it with the printing press. They sponsor on both sides thousands of publications designed to vilify the other side, but also to present and to project their own ideology. So this two-party system that grows out of this initial fraudulent bunch of charges on the part of Titus Oates and his fellows becomes, in effect, what saves Britain from being plunged again into civil war in the late 17th century. And it is a political system which has taken hold across the English-speaking world. I mean, it affects us today. We still have a two-party system. And its roots can be traced back to this particular political crisis. So that is to say that this was the most consequential non-conspiracy that has ever been known in the English-speaking world. Ultimately, what happens is that Charles II succeeds in suppressing the campaign for exclusion. When he dies in February of 1685, power passes peacefully to his brother, who remains a Roman Catholic. Charles himself was wily enough to avoid converting to Catholicism until he was on his deathbed, at which point it cost him nothing. His brother inherited a political position which was almost, it was as good a political position as any English monarch had enjoyed in living memory, because Charles II had succeeded in turning the Tory party into the dominant force in the political nation. The Whigs had been broken under Charles II. They, in fact, their leaders, in the aftermath of the failure of exclusion, created an assassination plot of their own, the so-called Rye House plot in 1683, which was a failure, but was a real conspiracy as opposed to the one that Titus Oates dreamed up. Their participation in that assassination plot resulted in the effective decapitation, and in some cases the actual decapitation, of the Whig leadership. So James inherits a political position which is almost completely unchallengeable. And yet, within 3 years, he managed to completely fritter away his dominance, and the result was his expulsion from England and his replacement by his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. Through that, in England, this is not the case in Ireland, but in England, that change of regime involved no violence. And I think we can say that a major reason for that was because the Popish Plot had led to the creation of these two political parties, which, as hostile as they were to one another, nevertheless had realized, they have created a system, a political system, in which resort to civil war and violence was not necessary. And that is about all I have to say.